Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alo Wash Processed Ethiopia from John Small Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And John Small, based out of Seoul, South Korea. And this is part 7 of our 7-part series featuring the 7 Korean coffees from our most recent blind taste test rankings video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that this coffee finished first place out of those 7 coffees on that day. And the main reason for this coffee's placement was because it did offer plenty of the wonderful washed Ethiopian characteristics, including a very nice level of florality and peachiness. And given that those are 2 of my favorite components within coffee in general, it's no surprise that it ended up being my favorite coffee on that day. But it's always interesting to see if it remained my favorite coffee by the end of the series. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is a little interesting, as this one felt slightly more developed than the Kenyan coffee, and I'd actually heard secondhand that a lot of the reason that this coffee turned out a little bit more developed than they were expecting was because of just how small the coffee beans themselves are. And I think that impacted the coffee ever so slightly, and for that reason, as I mentioned, it wasn't quite as light as the other coffee that we'd had from John Small. It's notably lighter still than the Hocus Pocus coffees that we also reviewed in this series, but even then I would say it's somewhere in the middle of these Korean coffees, where most people would probably align this with being either on the slightly more developed side of that light medium. Honestly, that's probably the best place I can put that. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression and blind taste test day, and this cup definitely stood out for having a notable bit of peachiness and clarity relative to the other coffees on that table. The cool down did have a slight bit of the listed lemongrass, but other than that, it was a pretty nice start. And once again, in that video, I just really could not help but pick this one out for having so many of those just really clean and wonderfully peachy and floral qualities. And I continue to harp on that, mostly because it really did impact the overall results on that video. Day 18 through the Chemex, and the cup definitely did have a slight bit more development in an isolated setting, so I noticed it significantly more when I did isolate it from the other coffees. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because some of those coffees definitely had a little bit more development to them, mostly thinking of those Hocus Pocus coffees. But outside of that, there was an abundance of florality and peachiness that more than made up for that quality. Classically washed Ethiopia with a light body and complementary citric tone yet again. Day 21 through the April brewer, and there's continued mixed feelings on this one, as the flavor profile is pretty well defined, and that's something that I really should focus on for the majority of this coffee, because it's going to be a lot of consistent notes about just how prominent and pronounced the floral and peachy qualities were within this coffee. The citric components remain a little bit more subtle relative to those, but the biggest issue is still that slightly smoky quality that hinders the rest of the cup. It's been pretty nice otherwise, and as I'm kind of looking at these notes and reflecting on it, I'm beginning to wonder whether or not the super soft water that we use for our coffee wasn't necessarily ideal for this coffee. We move on to day 24, as we opted for the V60 with slightly lower temperatures, and it was the best it had been to this point, as there was a slight bit of more definition to the peachiness and overall sweetness. Florality is pretty notably defined, with the listed jasmine being very prominent. I think one of the other notes they have listed on here is mango, and I could see it, but given just how abundant and well defined the peachiness is in this coffee, that was the primary fruit focus for me on it. Still, once again, ever so slightly hindered by the development, but very nice otherwise. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and more mixed results on this day, as the cup continues to be hindered by that slightly smoky quality. There's a slight bit less definition to the fruit and floral qualities, as they're still present, but in a much more toned down sense. Citric qualities a bit more pronounced as well, so this trade-off was certainly not worth it for me on this one. We move on to day 30, as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup did have a notably massive resurgence, as I would say this was by far the best we'd experienced of the coffee to this point. Notably more of the pronounced peachy and floral qualities, yet again, plenty of that jasmine, plenty of that peachiness. Once again, we're still getting, actually, interestingly, better clarity and a little less of that smoky quality. So for all of those factors, all of those reasons, that day 30 mark was a true standout up to that point. Day 33 through the Chemex, and this was another nice day, though I did have a slight preference towards the V60 with this coffee, as there's also a slight bit of this coconut-like aspect to complement the other components within this one, giving it a nice additional tropicality to it. The most consistency of this one, I would say this one has been mostly consistent, as it's remained very straightforward, especially for a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. Day 36, final notes we have through the V60, and I'm honestly beginning to wonder whether this coffee has dropped off ever so slightly, as once again here on this day 40 mark, it's not quite as impressive as that day 30 mark, as that one really seemed to be the best day of this coffee, as there's still an abundance of those stone fruit-like characteristics, but even then a slight bit more of that smoky quality, and I would say that the overall very defined tones have ever so slightly dwindled over time. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. And we will actually start with the finish level 4. So I really do enjoy the finish of this coffee, because even though you can feel that ever so slightly smoky quality lingering in the background, it is more than made up for by all the wonderful peachy and floral components. So those are not just at the forefront, but they do linger within the finish as well. And given that they are present in a much more sweet sense, as you can see the sweetness also scoring at that level 4, then I'm very happy with that aspect of this coffee, as those are two things that I very much enjoy. I mean, it's hitting pretty high on the marks that are very important to me, the cleanliness and the sweetness being the first two we're discussing. But let's move on to the other ones, as we have the florality at that level 4 mark. And that right there is the listed jasmine. And I'm really happy with the way the florality was presented within this coffee. It was very well defined, very pronounced, and it was an ever-present component to it. Rather than this one being a little bit more one note, just offering a stone fruit forward aspect, it did have enough florality to complement that and give it that classically wash-processed Ethiopian feel to it. Stone fruit, level 4. And that's the first thing and biggest standout thing of this coffee from the very first moment I tried it. And I do have to say that it was the most enjoyable part of this coffee. Anytime I get plenty of peachiness with a coffee, I'm very happy, especially when it does come from a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. So massive credit to them on that. This one stayed very true to the hopes and expectations for something of this nature. Now we'll move on to probably one of the most important parts of this, the cleanliness at that level 4 mark. And it says a lot about a coffee when there is a little bit of that smoky quality, as you can see that scoring there at that level 2 mark, that the cleanliness is still scoring at that level 4. It goes to show just how clean and well defined the rest of the coffee is, because it's one of those things where I could really take points off for that one thing hindering the overall experience of the coffee, but I don't want it to diminish just how prominent, pronounced, and defined all of those other aspects were within this coffee. This one is very straightforward in the peachy and floral sense, if I haven't hit that point home yet. So for that reason, even with the smokiness being there at that level 2 mark, there's enough cleanliness, clarity, and definition to this one to score there at that level 4 mark. Let's move on to the couple of level 3s we'll have. We'll start with the acidity, level 3. So this one right here, not necessarily the brightest coffee, and I didn't necessarily expect it to be the brightest coffee given what we were working with. So a little bit more medium, moderate in that regard. Citrus fruit, level 3. And when I originally saw the lemongrass listed here on this coffee, I was beginning to wonder whether or not that might be the more dominant and pronounced component, kind of hindering the rest of this one. And I have to say that the citric tones were significantly more toned down relative to the rest of the experience from this coffee. And if I went into this coffee with one big wish based off of what I saw from the notes on here, it would be that would be the tertiary quality, and it most certainly was, as it was definitely a little bit more pronounced in the stone fruit and floral qualities for this one. Last thing worth discussing, body at the level 1, and that was kind of interesting because I was expecting this one to be light bodied, but I think it just turned out a little bit lighter bodied than even I was expecting. I do wonder if that might have been a factor that I was brewing this one alongside of all of the other coffees, which had at least a little bit of body to them. I would say a little bit more body to them relative to this one. I do kind of wonder if I would still feel the same about this one being at that level 1 mark, though I do recall when making this tasting wheel, it was somewhere between the 1 and the 2. Nonetheless, very light-bodied cup of coffee, very tea-like in that regard. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. Between all of the coffees that we reviewed in this series, I think I have to say that it was that honey processed Ethiopia from Claremento that ended up being my favorite of all of those coffees. And it's for a lot of the reasons I mentioned in that video. It just had such a wonderfully clean and intense profile for what the coffee was. But that being said, this one was definitely very close to it for a number of reasons, and that of course being that it offered the big four that I'm looking for: great cleanliness, great sweetness, great florality, and a great fruit forward profile, all of which the type that I do enjoy, and all of which in notable abundance. Obviously, the one thing that held this coffee back was that ever so slight hindering smoky quality to it. And it's a little frustrating for one reason and one reason alone. I feel like this coffee is really, really close to being one of my favorite wash processed Ethiopian coffees that we've reviewed this entire year, if it wasn't for that one small thing holding it back. And I've said in the past that that shouldn't really affect coffees too much. We've reviewed a number of Kenyan coffees in the past that have had that same sort of quality to it. And if anything, I feel like it gives those coffees a little bit more characteristics, I should say a little bit more character to them. This one, on the other hand, I just feel like it was so close to being something that was just truly remarkable. A coffee that could have possibly even finished on our top 10 coffees of the year list if it just lacked that one specific quality to it. Outside of that, though, it's very nice. I had very positive experiences with this coffee roaster, so massive credit to John Small. I do think that they did a pretty nice job with this coffee regardless. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: this one has a lot of what you would hope for from a classic wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Definitely plenty of florality, definitely a very clean and fruit forward profile with a lighter body. So all of those things that you can expect very much present within this one. Only thing, obviously, keep in mind the profile of it being a little bit more developed. But outside of that, all of those expectations that you would have for a coffee like this are present within it. Best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts or impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Alo Wash Processed Ethiopia from John Small Roastery. Thank you for watching.